Hi everyone, welcome back to Biology 242 lectures. We are continuing with the reproductive system series. Why? Well, it's an 88 slide PowerPoint and it takes so long to record these things. So I'm working my way through them as fast as I possibly can. Okay, so we left off on mammary glands. I'm actually going to go back there before I make my screen look big. So the mammary glands produce milk, and I want to stress that both genetic males and genetic females have breast tissue, including precursors to the ductal system that develops during pregnancy. So both male and female mammals in general, so humans included, have nipples. And it is actually possible to get male breast tissue to lactate under certain circumstances. So this is another example of homology across the sexes. It's just that in most cases, the breast tissue that is meant to feed infants develops only during pregnancy and looks specifically like this. There are some exceptions due to hormone dysregulation, which I'll describe a little bit later when we actually talk about the hormones involved. So the mammary glands, obviously, if they are active or lactiferous, produce milk. And these are actually modified integumentary glands, and specifically their mode of secretion is apocrine. So just to remind you guys, this was a chapter 4 subject. Apocrine glands are responsible for secreting substances that are fatty in nature, and they do so by having the cells of the secretory acini pinch off at the top. So included in the apocrine secretion, whatever the watery stuff is, in this case it's a blood filtrate with stuff in it, like glycogen and glucose, etc. Parts of the cell actually come along for the ride, and that's what helps to contribute the fattiness of breast milk. So the glands themselves are located in the breast, which is a pectoral fat pad, varies in size and shape across individuals considerably. And then embedded in that fat pad is glandular tissue. So this glandular tissue only develops into a milk-producing tissue in the presence of the hormones of pregnancy. Additionally, you can see here that we have various supportive ligaments, Cooper's ligaments, and these are going to suspend the breast. So in a lactating breast, the milk is stored in these lactiferous sinuses until oxytocin stimulates milk letdown. So a lot of students get confused here because they think, well, isn't prolactin responsible for milk production, not oxytocin? I do want to stress here that milk production and milk letdown are different things. So prolactin is responsible for development of the gland. And oxytocin is responsible for release of the glandular product. So that's the real difference there. They're both involved with milk production, but at different ends of the process. Okay, so I mentioned hormones. And I will talk about the breast tissue thingy that I mentioned briefly over the next couple slides, and then we'll get to the endocrine feedback loops that are going to regulate the ovarian and uterine cycles, respectively. So the precursor to all steroid hormones is cholesterol. And here we're just showing you a subset of them, but I want to stress this is sex steroids like androgens and estrogens, glucocorticoids like cortisol and corticosterone, and mineralocorticoids as well, like aldosterone. So you need cholesterol to make all of this stuff. Side note about that, cholesterol basically looks like the following. You've got this little house-shaped ring, and then that And then usually cholesterol has this side fatty acid chain. So the first step in turning cholesterol into whatever the hormone is going to end up being is to cleave off this side chain. So get rid of this. So you can see progesterone here still has a little bit of a leftover of it, but that gets removed when you're making androgens and estrogens. So this is called cholesterol side chain cleavage enzyme. What a creative name. It says exactly what it does. And this is actually an enzyme that lives in the mitochondria. So in a very real sense, you rely on your mitochondria for ATP production so that you can, stay alive. But you also rely on your mitochondria to make steroid hormones. So mitochondria, I know everybody's like, they're the powerhouse of the cell. How does that information benefit me? Wah, 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 school is useless. But mitochondria definitely deserve our respect because they do a lot of things for us that we would not get by without. ATP production being the principal one, but I think that the role in steroidogenesis, as it's called, is pretty cool too. So the thecal cells on the outside of the follicle produce androstenedione. And androstenedione is converted easily into androgens proper. So androstenedione is considered to be an androgen precursor. And then it's really easy via an enzyme called aromatase to turn androgens like T into estrogens like estradiol. So what the granulosa cells do, so if we draw ourselves a little follicle here, and I'm going to draw a really lazy one, I don't want to take the time to draw all of the granulosa cells. So these are the granulosa cells, and then outside here we have the thecal cells. So the cells of the theca interna are going to make androstenedione. I'm going to write that as being A, and then the androstenedione is going to be translocated into the granulosa cells, and the granulosa cells turn that into E, and then the E enters both the antrum and the bloodstream. So that's how that works. And this is why circulating estrogens increase during the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. Okay, so this is a chart showing the steroidogenesis, so the synthesis of steroid hormones. It's not my favorite version of this chart. My preferred version lives on Wikipedia. So if you just enter the search term steroid hormones into Wikipedia, the second image, I believe, is the steroidogenesis pathway chart. It's quite interesting. So one of the things that this should show you is, one, here's cholesterol. So we think of cholesterol as being the bad guy because dietarily it's gotten a bad rap, but you actually need it. And this is also why sufficient leptin is required for maintenance of reproductive structures. So basically, you have to have enough body fat on deck to be able to spare the cholesterol to make this stuff. If you don't, your body is going to temporarily put pause on reproduction in favor of survival. Like I said, body is going to pick survival over reproduction every time, at least in the long term. Okay, so once you have that side chain cleaved off, you get pregnenolone, and then you have a bunch of pathways by which you can basically get to a variety of things. There are some arrows missing here because this is a relatively old chart from an older publication, but there's a lot of places on this chart here, for example, where you can convert back and forth between versions. So when I talk about both males and females having both androgens and estrogens, it's just a relative amounts thing. This is what I really mean. So part of that is going to be determined by the rate at which these particular enzymes act. So as you can see, androstenedione is interconvertible with testosterone. If you take androstenedione and you use aromatase on it, you get estrone. Also, this OE spelling is the British English spelling. We just use an E. Estrone is interconvertible with estradiol, which we call estrogen, even though it's one of the estrogens. And you can actually turn testosterone into estradiol really, really easily using aromatase as well. So, earlier I mentioned that both males and females have the potential to develop lactating breast tissue and to develop the sort of more globus pendulous breast that is characteristic typically of XX individuals. So how does that work? Well, there is a condition called gynecomastia, and this is a condition in which, for a variety of underlying reasons, an XY individual develops XX individual-like breast tissue. One of those reasons, although not the only one, is abuse of anabolic steroids. So people who inject testosterone are basically injecting a supraphysiological dose of testosterone in an effort to build muscle tissue, because testosterone is a upregulator of muscular hypertrophy. However, aromatase is going to take a lot of that extra testosterone and convert it into estradiol, and that ends up, quote unquote, feminizing the breast tissue of those individuals. It also ends up decreasing the amount of dihydrotestosterone available, and that in the long term actually decreases the size of the external genitalia as well. So I think the moral of the story there is fiddling around with hormonal synthesis pathways with the goal of, a different physique comes with a lot of risks, and it's generally inadvisable. Same cannot be said of taking hormones to transition, because that hormone administration is carefully planned and is administered or overseen by a medical professional that specializes in basically gender and sex affirming procedures to get people where they need to be. Abuse of anabolic steroids is illegal and is unregulated and unsupervised. So I'm talking about two different things there. Okay, so regulation of female reproduction. And remember, by female, I'm just referring to the gametic sex, nothing to do with gender identity whatsoever. So we've got gonadotropin releasing hormone, and that's going to cause the release of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Those are going to sequentially cause the release of estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin, respectively. So let's dig into this. There's a lot going on here, as you can see. So assuming that there is enough fat and therefore enough leptin signaling, so I'm going to add that in here because your book omits it. So leptin is going to tell the hypothalamus, hey, we are at a sufficient body fat content to do reproductive stuff. And that triggers the secretion of GnRH, so gonadotropin releasing hormone. Gonadotropin releasing hormone is going to travel down the hypophyseal portal veins and act on the anterior pituitary. So it's going to cause, in the immediate, FSH secretion. So this pulse of gonadotropin releasing hormone is going to right away kick off follicular development. So that happens first. So we get primordial follicles, a handful of them as we discussed. Turning into primary follicles. And as the primordial follicles transition to primary follicles and the follicles begin to develop, we see increases in estrogen. We also see increases in inhibin. So inhibin is going to feed back on the anterior pituitary And that's going to cause FSH secretion to decline, not immediately, but over time. So you would see a decline in FSH. And I'll show you what that looks like on a different diagram in a little bit here. So one of the reasons that this part of the picture is important is because it prevents runaway follicular development. So it sets a limit on the rate of follicular development, and it also sets a limit on how many of the follicles have their development initiated. So estrogens, before day 10 of the cycle, are going to inhibit the secretion of LH. Meanwhile, during follicular development, it's not the case that LH hasn't been being produced. It has, but it hasn't been being secreted. So there's a difference between production and secretion. So imagine during days 0 to 10, cells in the anterior pituitary are going to be busy making luteinizing hormone, but they're not releasing it. They're just storing it up in secretory vesicles waiting to go. So after day 10, estrogens instead have a releasing effect on the secretion. So basically, due to changes in receptor expression that aren't really addressed in your book and which we won't really go into, so don't worry too much about them, at around day 14, you get this huge release, basically all at once, of luteinizing hormone. And that is going to basically trigger ovulation. So we call this event the LH surge. So once ovulation occurs, the corpus luteum forms, and that secretes progesterone and estrogens, primarily progesterone, but also estrogens as well. So in addition to its participation in the feedback loop, what else does estrogen do? Well, it has effects on the CNS. Why is this so vague? Because they are broad and we haven't the time for them. It does stimulate bone and muscle growth. So this one in particular is why estrogen has an impact on your skeletal system and bone density. Establishment and maintenance of female secondary sex characteristics. So lack of facial hair, breast tissue, wider hips on average, etc. And then the maintenance of accessory glands and organs, so Bartholin's glands, greater vestibular glands, etc. And then progesterone is going to stimulate endometrial growth and secretion in the secretory phase. So this is just a summary of what estrogens do. And since we're going to approach the chart that shows the luteal cycle, or excuse me, the follicular cycle versus the uterine cycle, please know that the estrogens act on the endometrium of the uterus as well. They initiate the growth of the functional layer, the stratum functionalis. But that is not the only hormone that affects the stratum functionalis. So once ovulation has occurred, it's going to take a few days for the egg to get down the oviduct. And once ovulation has occurred, that's when the corpus luteum forms. So what this does is supercharges the supply of blood to the endometrium and stimulates endometrial gland secretion. So this is both going to prepare the uterus to receive an embryo, if one is present. Progesterone also inhibits GnRH. So here's why that happens. There's a timing function here. So there is no way for the corpus luteum to quote unquote know whether or not a pregnancy has occurred during this time. So basically progesterone is in place to, one, prepare the embryo, or prepare the uterus to receive an embryo, but also two, to hold off on additional pulses of GnRH, because you don't want to start the cycle over prematurely if an embryo is on its way to implant. So it's a timing function. if no pregnancy occurs, which means that the embryo is not going to signal the corpus luteum to stick around, then you get this decline of LH with degeneration of the corpus luteum following that. And that also sends progesterone levels down. We discussed inhibin, so I'm going to move on from here. So the secretion of GnRH in males for spermatogenesis is relatively steady. This is not true in females. So early in the cycle, when estrogen is low, so when follicular development is in between, GnRH pulse frequency is between 16 and 24 pulses per day. So it goes up from 16 to 24. So we get this increase in pulse frequency over time. So this is going to begin to stimulate increasing amounts of FSH secretion, and that will end up triggering follicular development. After about day 10, the elevated estrogen stimulates LH secretion, not production, but secretion. And during this time, the GnRH frequency is about 48 pulses per day, so 2 per hour. And this is what ends up causing the luteinizing hormone surge. So here is that chart that I promised to show you. And I want to stress that we're expressing GnRH not in raw amount, but in pulse frequency. So this units per liter does not apply to GnRH. It's pulse frequency. So you can see that as follicle stimulating hormone rises, estrogens rise as well. So if we draw a trajectory, it goes that way. And you can also see that inhibin increases with follicular development, but not as much. And you can also see that with inhibin, we get this downturn in FSH secretion. During this time, estrogens are also acting on the uterus. So prepare endometrium. So once the GnRH pulse frequency reaches about 48, which you can see here, and once the receptor expression in the anterior pituitary has changed enough that estrogen is now having a permissive effect on the release of LH, then you get the LH surge right there. So that's obviously going to correspond to ovulation. And then we get a corpus luteum forming, secreting progesterone. So you can see that it's contributing to this large hump in progesterone. But if no pregnancy occurs, it degenerates into a corpus albicans, which doesn't have any endocrine function because it is scar tissue. So that accounts for this phase right here, where the amount of the hormones is declining. So progesterone, estrogen, and inhibin all take a steep dive because the corpus luteum is not secreting those and it's going away as well. Okay, so here we have changes in the endometrium. I wish my screen was big enough to show you all of those charts lined up. Unfortunately, it is not. Okay, so during menses, which is, the start over point, day 28/0, that's why it says that, we have got destruction of the stratum functionalis due to, so I'm going to add this in here, declining progesterone. During the proliferative phase, this is the time during which estrogen is encouraging rebuilding of the stratum functionalis. So the growing amount of estrogen due to the increase in size of the ovarian follicles is going to facilitate that. And then this is increases in progesterone following ovulation. That really kicks uterine secretion into high gear. And then if no pregnancy occurs, we get back to the beginning. Before I move on from here, a student asked during lecture, and I thought it was a good question, why do we see the increase in basal body temperature that we do corresponding to ovulation? And I said, gosh, I don't know, I'll look it up. So I did. I didn't find anything. So first I plugged it into regular Google, and of course all I got was fertility websites saying, hey, your basal body temperature increases during ovulation. Nothing about why. It was all in service of, people trying to conceive, not for scientists. So I bopped on over to Google Scholar, and I was like, maybe the science corner of Google knows this, so I typed in some search terms. And again, plenty of research on, variation in basal body temperature and how accurately it can be used to predict ovulation, yada, 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 as well as, circulating enzymes and progesterone amounts, but nothing about specifically what causes the increase. So the answer is still, for the time being, I don't know. However, like I said during lecture, I would suspect, because the hypothalamus is also the thermostat of the body, that it has something to do with the feedback loop back onto the hypothalamus. So that's my best guess for right now. One important thing to do if you're a scientist is to be able to admit when you don't know things. It's like central to being able to do your job. Okay. So here's all of that summarized. I'm not going to go back through everything I just showed you, because of course you can just rewind this video if you'd like. But what I would recommend is get really comfortable with this chart, because I'm likely to ask you about elements of it on the test. It's an important thing to understand for regulation of both the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle, and the events, leading up to the possibility of pregnancy, and then what happens if one does not occur. So the cyclical nature of these hormones is really important. All right, so we've been talking about reproductive stuff, and we haven't actually talked about sex, copulation. So again, I said this previously in another video, I think it's important to acknowledge that human beings have sex for reasons other than procreation. So the reason I'm mentioning this is because I'm at some point going to have to discuss the phenomenon of orgasm, and, the utility of orgasm in males versus females is different. So just warning, this video is obviously not for kids. I've selected it being not for kids on the YouTube thingy, but I know that some of my students have children and like to listen to the lectures while they do other things. So if that's you and you're like chilling, doing the dishes, hanging out with your kiddos in the kitchen, maybe now is the time to put your headphones on, unless you want them to get a really detailed precursor of the birds and the bees talk. Perhaps beyond their understanding, to be honest. We'll see. Okay, so way back in 241, I mentioned to everybody in that class that there are a couple places where the autonomic nervous system halves come together to perform a function in unison. So there's this handshake between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system to achieve certain physiological processes, and sex is one of those. So sex to completion does not get done without both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. So arousal, and we're talking about people with penises and scrotums first, initiates parasympathetic impulses in the pelvic nerves. So remember from 241 that sympathetic nervous system is craniosacral, parasympathetic is what we call thoracolumbar. So we have, my bad, opposite. I need more coffee. So sympathetic is thoracolumbar, parasympathetic is craniosacral. This is a problem with not drinking enough coffee and trying to write while you talk and think all at once. So craniosacral is, so it skips the thoracolumbar region, and that's why you're seeing these pelvic nerves coming down from the sacral spine and not above. So the pelvic nerves are going to release nitric oxide. So remember, NO is a gasotransmitter. And remember, that is going to dilate penile arteries and clitoral arteries as well. We'll talk about that. And basically allow more blood to enter the erectile tissues of the pelvis than is able to leave. So NO is a potent smooth muscle relaxer, and it only acts quite locally because it's a very small, incredibly soluble molecule. So its effects are pronounced, to say the least. So this is what permits erection of the penis. Interesting side note about erectile function and or dysfunction. So dilation of smooth muscle in general is capable of dilating blood vessels because the walls of blood vessels, including both arteries and veins, but primarily arteries, are lined with smooth muscle. Because of this, certain medications for blood pressure attempt to act on smooth muscle to decrease its tone and widen blood vessels to decrease arterial blood pressure. So that's the mode of operation of some high blood pressure medications. So let me tell you a story about a little drug called sildenafil citrate. Sildenafil citrate has been shown in a variety of studies, primarily in vitro, to relax smooth muscle by basically fiddling around with the nitric oxide cellular signaling cascade. So it's related. So doctors thought, or clinicians thought, hey, if it locally dilates smooth muscle, then maybe we can use sildenafil citrate as a blood pressure medication because it's going to dilate the arteries and make systemic blood pressure go down a little bit due to a relaxation of blood vessels. So the FDA gives permission to begin clinical trials, and clinical trials get underway. Participants in the study are going to take either a placebo pill or the pill in question and then go get physicals regularly to have their vitals monitored. Most double-blind clinical trials look like that. They're designed very well. One important part of a clinical trial for a drug, and this is how you get information about side effects, is to ask your participants if they're noticing anything unusual about their physiology that they didn't notice before taking whatever the thing is. So in the sildenafil citrate case, participants in the study who had penises and who were not receiving the placebo said, well, I'm not noticing any changes in my blood pressure. That's pretty clear. But I am sure getting a lot of erections, sometimes ones that are so long that I have to go to the hospital. So they basically, the creators of the drug were like, well, it really doesn't work for systemic blood pressure. It just seems to work for erectile tissue, specifically penises. But we can use that. So what they did was they basically remarketed the drug and gave it FDA approval, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is how Viagra was born. Viagra was initially intended to be a blood pressure medication, but it turns out it only really alters the blood pressure in the penis. Surprise! There are also nerves to the nipples, and these are going to stimulate smooth muscle contraction, creating an erection of the nipple, in both males and females, too. So, if the arousal phase is continued, so typically initial arousal is mental and visual stimulation. And this is, again, another example of that mind-body connection, right? So, although we think of our cognition and our physiology as being separate, they really aren't. So the way you think and feel does have an effect on the homeostatic mechanisms of your body. So if the arousal continues, the bulbourethral glands begin to make their secretions. And that's because at that point, physiologically, intercourse is anticipated. And so again, you need to clear any extra urea out of the urethra to protect the spermatozoa and lubricate the glans penis in anticipation of intromission. Reminder here, intromission is the medical and scientific term for insertion of the penis into the vagina. So, assuming intercourse takes place, rhythmic stimulation of very, very many receptors, primarily those on the glans penis, basically begin to increase sympathetic tone. And I'm specifying the glans here because in this particular picture, the prepuce is intact. So this individual is uncircumcised. The glans penis is incredibly sensitive. It has a very high density of nerve endings in it, and part of the job of the prepuce is to prevent it from being overstimulated. Now, for various religious and cultural reasons, parents of children with penises may or may not choose to circumcise their children. But as far as there being a very compelling or strongly backed up medical reason to do that, there isn't one. There have been studies that show that circumcised males are at slightly less of a risk for contracting viral infections like HIV via unprotected sexual intercourse, but those arguments become pretty moot fairly quickly when you think about or consider the idea that safer sex practices include using condoms. So, assuming sexual intercourse proceeds, you initiate the processes of emission. So remember, I want to stress this, emission does not equal ejaculation. Why did I put that in there? Again, hard to write and talk at the same time. So emission is the spurring on of the glandular secretions of semen prior to ejaculation. So this is going to basically mix up a batch of semen, including spermatozoa, in preparation for ejaculation. So if the stimulation continues, ejaculation is the result. So how does ejaculation work? Well, they are rhythmic contractions of some muscles associated with the penis and the pelvic floor. So the ischiocavernosus muscle basically wraps around the base of the penis. So we can see it here. And it also has attachments to the pelvic triangle. So basically what it does is stiffens the base of the penis and widens it. The bulbospongiosus muscle is this guy right here. And the bulbospongiosus muscle is going to rhythmically compress and push upwards, which, so here it is here, pushes the bulb of the penis such that the semen that is concentrated here moves away from the pushed zone. And it does so rhythmically, which is why ejaculation and semen expulsion doesn't happen all at once. It happens in a series of rhythmic contractions of these muscles. Oh, whoops, I accidentally used my... There we go. Okay, so let's look at the other side of things. There's a lot of stuff in common. Unsurprisingly, because we have so many homologous structures, right? So arousal is going to initiate parasympathetic impulses. So again, craniosacral, pelvic nerve mediated. And at this time of things, stuff's the same. So nitroxidergic fibers are going to dilate the arteries in the clitoral tissues and increase blood delivery. The veins of those tissues, meanwhile, haven't changed sides. So more blood is getting in than getting out, and that contributes to erection and engorgement of both the clitoris and the vestibular bulbs. Same deal with nipples. So smooth muscle contraction in and around the nipple and areola cause the erection of the nipple. So, assuming mental and physical stimulation proceeds beyond the initial arousal phase, the greater vestibular glands begin to make secretions. So this secretes mucus into the vestibule, so the area between the labia minora, as well as the labia minora themselves. So it provides a lubricating function, just as the bulbourethral glands and the pre-ejaculate lubricate the glans penis in anticipation of intromission. So the physiology of both participants is going to facilitate intromission here. There's also secretion of mucus-like substances by the vaginal mucosa. So, rhythmic mechanical contact of the clitoris and the vaginal wall, as well as other stimuli, results in rhythmical contractions of both the vagina, but also the uterus. So ordinarily, the uterus kind of sits forward and the cervix points kind of backwards. So the vagina is like this. With rhythmic contraction due to sexual stimulation, the uterus actually tips backwards a little bit so that it stands up, and the cervix gets repositioned to be a little bit more vertical. There's also a phenomenon called vaginal tenting, where the distal end of the vagina near the cervix experiences contraction and becomes broader and flatter. It is thought that these two actions facilitate fertilization. So the rhythmical contractions and tipping of the uterus causes the cervix to dip into a pool of semen that might be there, increasing the likelihood of conception. So the same two muscles are involved with the wall and the pelvic floor, the bulbospongiosus and the ischiocavernosus, with an additional step, and that is the stimulation of the Skene's glands, also called the paraurethral glands. These may release fluid during stimulation because, remember, the urethra and the vaginal canal are next to each other, and the network of paraurethral glands actually runs between them, so they will release fluid when stimulated to do so. So, orgasm in both sexes is a bunch of things at once. So it's rhythmic contraction of smooth muscle of the reproductive tracts, driven by, you guessed it, oxytocin, and rhythmic contractions of the ischiocavernosus and bulbospongiosus via pelvic reflexes. So these two muscles are skeletal muscles, meaning that they're normally under voluntary control. But of course, as we all know, voluntary control of skeletal muscle can be hijacked by reflexes, and this is one of those times. So these events are going to culminate in ejaculation in the male and in the vaginal tenting and uterine tipping, as well as pleasurable sensations for both parties. So that is what orgasm is for. It has a dual purpose. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to read the changes in sexual reproductive function with age. I'm not going to describe them to you, but I do want to stress that menopause is more familiar to people in general than male climacteric. So menopause is generally associated with cessation of menstruation as well as declining estrogen levels. But males actually do undergo declines in sex hormone production with age as well. So you see a decline in testosterone over time, for example. It's just that the outcome of those two things are a little bit different because of the different fertility windows for the two sexes. And that is the end of reproduction. Finally. So I'm going to hop off now and make a new video that we start with blood. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope you learned a lot, and I will see you in the next video where we talk about blood. Ha ha ha. And that was my lame attempt at a vampire joke. Good day.